Some people are asking whether Joe Biden has lived up to his Trump-appointed nickname, Lion Biden, once again, now that his plan to cancel $10,000 of student debt for nearly 44 million Americans was enjoined by the courts. Last week, just days after young voters warded off the red wave, both an Eighth Circuit court and a Texas judge vacated a policy that served as a huge inducement to get young voters to the polls: student debt cancellation. Some people are asking, did Biden ever intend to cancel any debt in the first place? Now, let's take a closer look at how this played out. The Texas judge, Judge Pittman, argued that the legislative authority Biden used as a hook for his executive power, the HEROES Act, was too narrow. It's a post-9/11 act intended to provide debt relief for first responders and the like. The Biden administration argued that COVID was a similar type of emergency. But it doesn't take a legal expert to see the holes in that theory. As I explained over a month ago on this very program and also on my own podcast, Bad Faith, Biden has repeatedly claimed that the COVID crisis is over. Moreover, the Supreme Court, through its rulings, has indicated that it agrees, striking down other COVID-era programs like the eviction moratorium and vaccine mandates. It's obvious that the COVID hook is just a pretext for a policy that's not really COVID-based. Heck, even Biden himself has said the reason we need student debt relief is the structural problems which have led to high education costs. And he's right. But instead of using the Higher Education Act of 1965, which was designed to address exactly that type of problem, he used a legislative hook which seemed designed to fail, not just because of conservative judges, but liberal judges too. Here's what Fordham Law professor Judge Sugarman had to say on my podcast a month ago.
I think the Biden administration could lose this 9-0. And instead of running against the Roberts court thinking it's a win, I think it'll be an embarrassment that actually frustrates, that alienates the base because it says you were incompetent. And that's my real concern here is I have to be, this experience of finding this problem has made me a little more cynical about what the goals are here.
Welcome to the club.
Yes.
And as a reminder, student debt payments have been suspended since Trump was president. And since the authority used to do so was the Higher Education Act, why would someone choose to pivot from an authority which has held up without challenge for years? The administration's incompetence gets even worse than that, though. You see, the people who have standing to challenge student debt cancellation, mostly the corporations hired to process student debt by the government, they were going to mount a challenge to the policy regardless of what legal authority Biden relied upon. That's why advocates at the Debt Collective, the leading student debt advocacy group, have been warning that Biden should not delay relief. He should just do it. Cancel student debt immediately, day one. Remember, the debt is federally held. Just like I could say, hey, don't worry about paying me back if I bought you lunch. Biden can simply forgive it. And once canceled, the debt would be exceedingly difficult to reassign. The Eighth Circuit, the first court that blocked relief, all but admitted that this was why an injunction was necessary. It's precisely because it's a policy that's very hard to undo. But Biden put his desire to means test the policy ahead of his commitment to actually making sure student debt cancellation goes into effect. By announcing it and then putting up an application and giving people weeks to fill it out, he gave corporate-backed groups angling to maintain the status quo time to forum shop. That is, to find a friendly judge and get an injunction. Instead of taxing any unfair windfalls back from the rich, no one now is going to get relief. And maybe, just maybe, this is what Biden wanted all along. Remember, Joe Biden was colloquially known as the senator from MBNA, a major bank since acquired by Bank of America, which, like many corporations, is headquartered in Delaware, where Biden was a senator for 36 years. Delaware's corporate-friendly laws attracted corporations, and those corporations elected politicians who served their interests. It's no accident that Joe Biden is why students, unlike most other debtors, find it next to impossible to discharge their loans in bankruptcy. Biden had to be dragged kicking and screaming to $10,000 in debt cancellation, and his since-forgotten promise to cancel all debt for graduates of historically black colleges and universities now looks like a last-ditch bid to turn out much-needed black voters in the 2020 Georgia runoff. But like his promise to send out $2,000 checks and to fight for a $15 minimum wage, his commitment to full HBCU cancellation was never brought up by the Democratic Party acolytes who claim to care so much about black voters. In his $10,000 of student debt, the victory that he announced was about as short-lived as Dr. Oz's Pennsylvania residency. Now, when I first raised the possibility that Biden's student debt plan was a bait and switch over a month ago, I was tentative. I hoped for the best, but feared for the worst. But when Thursday's court decision came down, just days after the youth vote was shown to be the levee that stopped the red wave, it was difficult not to draw certain conclusions. Now, I can't prove anything, but a pattern is certainly emerging. Democrats authorized Cori Bush's protest on the steps of Congress and then acquiesced to her demand to continue the eviction moratorium. The left celebrated, but the next day, the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. Would Democrats have agreed to the extension had they known that the victory would be so short-lived? Had they not known, rather, that it would be so short-lived? I don't know, truly. Similar questions are now mounting around student debt cancellation, but this situation differs from the eviction moratorium because the decision isn't yet final. Joe Biden may prove his motives one way or the other, still to come. Will he cancel student debt or not? As a lawyer for the debt collective, Sparky Abraham tweeted last week, if POTUS had just canceled student debt and announced it after the fact, courts wouldn't have been able to stop it. He can still do that. He can still do that. If he doesn't, it will be difficult for him to argue that he made a good faith effort to follow through on his campaign promises. I'm not asking anyone to take my theory here on faith, but it is important that Biden be pressured to do what he can do to save this program. And liberal apologists, I gotta tell you, you aren't helping. Blue check Georgetown professor Don Moynihan jumped at the opportunity to defend Biden, but not with an actual argument. Instead, he pretended that there was some inconsistency between my claim that it's within Biden's executive power to cancel student debt and my argument that he chose bad legal authority as a hook for said executive power, perhaps intentionally. Don's reasoning skills aren't making the best case for the value of higher education, I'm afraid. Also not making the best case, the plaintiffs in the Texas case, one of whom is literally suing on the grounds that he isn't poor enough to qualify for the $20,000 of relief available only to Pell Grant recipients, i.e. the poorest debtors. The other is suing on the grounds that she has private loans that didn't qualify for Biden's policy. And while I would happily cancel her debt if I were designing the program, my sympathy for her is diminished somewhat by her willingness to take $48,000 in PPP loans without complaint. It takes a liberal to enthusiastically and uncritically side with these characters and the senator from MBNA against millions of eligible student debtors, 90% of whom make less than $75,000 a year. Social workers, teachers, truckers, nurses, your kids, your grandparents, and your spouses. But here we are, liberals leading other liberals to the slaughter, insisting that Biden is just a stand-up, ice cream-loving guy doing his best. The truth is that there are only two options here. That Joe Biden intentionally designed this policy in a way that made it highly unlikely that any student debt would be canceled, or that his administration is filled with incompetence. And I gotta say, neither bodes well for the future of the nation.
Well, I sincerely hope this program fails. I'm not sure. I mean, this is interesting. I'm not sure that I do think Biden set it up to fail on purpose.
Why is
but
that?
It seems too Machiavellian for him.
Well, what explanation is there? Because there were warnings about this, right? Jed Sugarman, the law professor that I interviewed on my show, he didn't just pop up on a little indie podcast. He wrote an article in the Atlantic. He first was engaging in a different article with Larry Tribe, Harvard law professor, and then ended up getting his own spin-off article in the Atlantic, elaborating on why he had concerns about how Biden's
maybe Biden can't get out of it's a pandemic, I can do whatever I want mindset. Like, that's his preferred rationalization for things because that's how he's governed for the
Right.
last...
Well, that would be incompetence.
Yeah.
So that's the other
No,
option.
that's what I think it is.
But the reality of the situation is they had been warned for a long time. The advocates over at the Debt Collective, who have been really championing this policy since long before Biden won the primary, have been very clear about what the strategic avenues are that would best lead to success. And there is a reason why they have been saying he should cancel student debt day one. After rallies, they have a giant pen that's like the size of a man, and they hoist it around, and they say he can do it with a stroke of a pen. He should do it day one. And part of this is part of the reason that Biden has literally given challengers the opportunity to make these bad faith arguments. You don't have to support student debt to appreciate that it's a ridiculous argument to say I make too much money to qualify for the program, and therefore it is unfair to me. And other legal experts have gotten more into the weeds about how some of the actual legal findings in the Eighth Circuit case in particular are just bad law. But that's for lawyers to work out. In the meantime, the student loan moratorium was supposed to end at the end of the year. It's unclear what's going to happen. The Biden administration has made noises about extending it, but even that can't be indefinite because that is a COVID-era program as well. And unfortunately, I think a lot of Democratic voters got duped. And they went to the polls thinking that Biden did something good for them. Young voters in particular thought that Biden did something good for them. And now there's a cover-up in place to try to make it seem like Biden was a good faith actor and couldn't have predicted any of this. And I think that's not right. And voters should know what they're going into if they're going to vote for Democrats.
Sure, I think if it makes it to the Supreme Court, which it might, I think under any legal justification, the Supreme Court is likely to find that this doesn't hold up.
Yeah.
And then Democrats and Biden will blame the Supreme Court and say you need to elect
I think
more,
that's
you
right.
need to elect Democrats in perpetuity.
Like they've been doing with
Supreme Court with
abortion.
Democrats, something
Yeah.
that's going to take 50 years.
Yeah, and in Joe Biden's parlance, I just happen to think that that's malarkey, and Democrats need to wake up.
All right, more rising after this. Stay with us.
Some say crime has become the dark horse issue of the November midterms, according to CNN Politics, that is. While polling reveals that the economy still ranks as the top issue on voters' minds, crime is next. 71% of registered voters say it's either extremely or very important. Pew Research data shows amongst registered Democrats, 82% of black voters and 33% of white voters see violent crime as a very important voting issue this year. Joining us now to weigh in is movement lawyer Olayemi Olarin and Nick O'Neill Fellow at the Manhattan
I'm going to
Institute.
look this girl up. She's really good.
Welcome to you both.
Hey, good morning.
So I'll start with you, Ole. What do you make of the gap between white voters and black voters, with black voters saying that they prefer, that they value or prioritize crime more as an issue, yet them identifying more and voting more for Democrats who broadly in the cultural discourse are being characterized as soft on crime, as it were?
You know, it's this whole myth that only half of the spectrum cares about crime. Everybody cares about crime in the sense that everyone is concerned about safety. That's not the disagreement. No one has ever disputed that black people care about crime too and white people care about crime. It's about how we respond to it. It's this idea that caring about crime is synonymous with supporting tough on crime policies. And that is just not true. I think also we have to talk about what's effective and ineffective. America's always cared about crime. Crime has always been a top issue and a top thing that's discussed in our media and in our elections, has always been it. I also think it's worth mentioning that this poll is discussing that Americans feel like crime is raised rather than any actual facts about whether or not crime is actually up, because there's a lot to do with the fear-mongering in the media and why people feel unsafe whether or not they are safe. But here, I think what this actually just boils down to is we have different ideas on how we respond to crime and how we address public safety. It's not really so much about crime, so much as it about safety. And right now, we've continued to put tons and tons of money. America puts more money into prison and policing and addressing crime. That way, an proven ineffective method for addressing crime for decades and decades and decades, and it hasn't done anything. So to me, it's not really much about whether or not we care about crime or who cares about it more, what the gap is. I think we all care about crime and public safety. I think it's just about certain groups and different advocates recognizing that policing and mass incarceration doesn't do anything to address public safety.
Raphael, I want to get your perspective on this. Crime getting much worse in at least some places. Philadelphia, for instance, is really suffering right now. What are the policy, if Republicans want to run on this issue successfully and say that, Democratic policies have left some of our cities vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera. What are Republicans saying that they're going to do differently, or what should they be saying?
Well, I think what their focus needs to be is highlighting the fact that the Democrats have sort of made it part of their central brand that they are for decarceration and depolicing. They are for diverting more people away from prisons and jails. They are for releasing more people from prisons and jails. You have the Cut 50 initiative, which Biden, committed to supporting all on the campaign trail. I think Republicans need to do the work of showing what the connection is between that kind of policy agenda and the sorts of crimes that people are worried about. The reality is that the vast majority of people in prison today are people who have somewhere between 10 and 12 prior arrests and 5 and 6 prior convictions. These are not people who've been denied second chances. These are people who pose a significant threat to the public. We know that because the recidivism data tells us that 83% of people released from state prison in the U.S. are going to go on to reoffend at least once, which means that prison is already largely reserved for repeat chronic offenders.
This guy's a fucking asshole, man. This guy's a real dick.
If we push a policy agenda that is going to put more of those individuals on the street, we're going to see more victimizations as a result. And that's, I think, the message that Republicans would be most effective at pushing right now.
Well, I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
It's so funny how we use the mass incarceration and mass incarceration's failures as a grounds and an argument for why we should continue to mass incarcerate. The reality is we currently have mass incarceration, and despite the statistics that you're pointing out, first and foremost, over 80% of the criminal cases that are in our legal system are misdemeanors, traffic offenses, or non-violent crime. It has nothing to do with violent crime. That's first and foremost. But second of all, saying that we have a criminal system that preys on particular populations, because that's the truth. The vast majority of the people in our criminal system are poor, are living beneath the poverty line, are represented by public defenders. So taking the fact that poor people are already disproportionately incarcerated and profiled by a criminal system and then put into prison and come with all the collateral consequences that come with that, the rap sheet, the inability to get a job, the inability to get housing, and everything that comes from that, and say, hey, those populations that we have criminalized and we put into prison, they continue their recidivists. They continue to do the same thing. We continue to put them back there. So it sounds like the approach to addressing crime has been ineffective. That's what we're saying. And as much as I would love, I would love for it to be what you're saying about the Democrats be true, that they have embraced a profile, a platform of decarcerating and moving us away from mass incarceration. That would be beautiful if they have, but they haven't. If you look at places like New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, all these places that they keep trying to paint as Gotham City or the most dangerous places ever, despite the fact that not only do Republican and rural areas have more crime per capita, but New York City and places like this spend more money on policing and mass incarceration than anybody else. So we have to pick a struggle. It can't just be, mass incarceration and policing and incarceration, that's what's linked to public safety, which, by the way, tons of statistics and studies have already showed that that's not the case. But more importantly, we're already doing it. So if the problem is that, we mass incarceration and policing and prisons is what we should be doing to address crime, well, we're already doing it. And according to y'all, it's not safe, it's not working. So how could that be the successful platform that people should be running on?
Well, Rafael, let me ask you this. For example, about half, 53% of LA's budget, the entire city budget, is devoted to funding policing. Do you think that a larger percentage of these city budgets should be going to policing? Is the answer to continue to throw money at the issue, as Alay points, has been the plan for the last however many decades that this country has existed and the police force has existed? At what point do you think a strategy change needs to be implemented if there is, in fact, no correlation between driving up police funding to, again, 50% of the city budget, more than all the other social support services that keep people out of poverty and all the other drivers of crime? At what point is it better to reinvest those funds elsewhere if it's clear that just more and more money isn't correlating with lower incidents of crime?
Well, I think the first thing to address is that it's actually not clear that more money directed toward policing isn't correlated with crime. Every single study that's ever been done of investments in policing shows positive returns on those investments.
I'm sorry, Olivia, but that's very, very plainly not true.
I couldn't
Can you
disagree
cite
more.
a specific study? I'm happy to pull it up.
Yeah, sure. Aaron Shelton looked at police spending in 2010 and found $1.63 return for every dollar spent on policing in 2010.
So
You have the
stupid,
paper out of the University of Pennsylvania.
I should say such a genius.
Can you help me understand what it means to have $1.63 return on $1 worth of spending on the police?
Sure, for every dollar spent on policing, they were able to calculate the reduced victimization costs, which mainly came from a reduction in homicides. Aaron Chalfin, along with Morgan Williams and a couple of other economists, were also the lead authors of a study showing that for every single police officer hired, you abate 0.1 homicides. And that those effects are felt twice as much in the Black community as in the white community. So that's just one of, or two of very many studies showing that when you invest more in policing, when you increase police presence, you reduce crime in that area. It's one of the most common findings in the criminological literature.
Help me understand this then. You're arguing that Democrats have defunded the police. In fact, Democrats have raised police budgets across the country. At the same time, conservatives are saying that crime rates are up. Now, mostly there's a lot of reporting on crime rates that have given people a sense that crime rates are up. But regardless, if crime rates are up is the argument, and also Democrats have in fact been fighting the police harder. I wish that weren't the case. I don't believe in that as a policy, but they have in fact been doing it. I don't understand. They're already doing what you want them to do, so it's hard for me to grasp what the argument is here. How can you claim that there is a correlation between lower crime rates and funding when we're seeing higher crime rates and higher police funding?
Well, it would be even higher than if we were not doing the investment in policing
Exactly.
that we're doing now,
the
right?
question is whether or not we are worse off than we otherwise would have been had we been taking the right steps. And that's the answer to the question, right? That
I'm sorry to interrupt.
America makes up, what, 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population. America spends about $277 billion on policing every year and another $80 billion on prison. If we're looking at a place like New York City, which is the place that people like to use as a target for Gotham City, we have 35,000 officers in the NYPD. We give over $10.4 billion in spending. We give $860 million in Rikers, and we've increased that number every year. We have continued to increase, even from 2020 to now. We've increased police funding. We've increased the amount of money we put in mass incarceration, and according to what y'all are saying, it is not safer. So tell me how this strategy, and by the way, Democrats, Democratic mayor, Democratic governor, Democrat in every office, Democrat in the DA's office, and they are Democrats that are in fact putting more money into policing and mass incarceration. So which is it? Again, which is it? Is it the fact, or is it dangerous because we're not putting enough money into policing and mass incarceration? Are Democrats failing because they are not arguing this enough, or they have a decarcerating platform to acknowledge that they don't have that?
I mean, I think it's really easy to just continue to say the opposite of what's true, but the reality is that the NYPD has down more than 7% of its officers since 2020. The reality is that the New York State has instituted bail reform, it's instituted discovery reform, it's instituted raise the age legislation, it's instituted less is more. Right, I understand that.
Police officers chose to leave. That wasn't a defunding the police issue. We're talking about police funding, not police deciding.
I didn't say that it was, but we did cut two entire academy classes as a result of the defunding, and that creates lag, which takes time to refill that.
We have to be clear about what was and wasn't done.
But there was, okay, let's look at, Raphael, I want to get your perspective on what's going on. Again, I put Philadelphia, where the violent crime rate is, everyone admits, is up very precipitously. The youth gun deaths way up. And I'm looking at this report produced by Philadelphia lawmakers, Philadelphia House, criticizing Larry Krasner, the progressive prosecutor, who has not been, according to this report, prosecuting illegal gun possessions, and so there are more people with legal guns on the streets, and thus more crime. That's the implication here, which does, in my view, what's your perspective on that, Raphael? Does impugn progressive policies.
Yeah, I think that's just one example of lowering the transaction costs of crime and making it more likely that you're going to see exactly that kind of behavior. I mean, the idea that Larry Krasner diverting a significantly higher rate of gun offenders than his predecessor has not impacted public safety is, I think, one of the silliest ideas that you could perpetrate. And it's not one that's actually been looked at by any of the studies that people will point to claim that progressive prosecution doesn't have an effect on crime. Right? These studies showing, for example, that you can pick out progressive prosecutor cities that had lower crime increases than non-progressive prosecutor cities. Well, that doesn't really tell you a lot, especially given the fact that Baltimore is one of them. But the reason for that is that it peaked in 2019. It set an all-time homicide rate record, and so the fact that crime went down in 2020 in Baltimore, despite having Marilyn Mosby as the progressive prosecutor, doesn't tell you anything about what progressive prosecutors do or don't do. Again, I mean, what you have here is a kind of rhetorical ploy where you pretend that the argument is something that it's not. The argument here is not that progressive prosecutors are responsible for the entirety of the uptick. The argument here is that these policies leave us worse off than we otherwise would be. And that's not been tested by any of the studies that have been pointed to.
Well, Rafael, I do want to ask you about this because there was a study that came out. There was a more recent study than this, but there's something called the red state murder problem, where homicide rates are especially high in conservative states, and that's been linked to gun policies there. And very rarely, and I think this is right that this doesn't happen a lot. Very rarely do you hear Democrats saying, hey, it's Republican, like, tough on crime policy. There's pointing to gun policies for sure, but the idea that different groups of people, because of who runs a state, are kind of insensitive to crime as a consequence of crimes happening in their state, I think is a kind of craven and not especially productive way to go about talking about these issues. So I have no interest in blaming people in red states for horrible tragedies that are happening there, but it does seem to be a really selective bias that says, well, crime is up all over the country. It's not, but the crime is up all over the country. This city, which is a large metropolis, which tends to be Democrat because people of color live there and are fans of the historical social programs that allowed people to have access to the franchise, etc. And therefore, there's more crime there, when of course similar things are happening in red states where there are a high crime rates, etc. What is the solution, in your view, to actually bringing down crime if, again, crime is very much correlated to poverty? When you see downswings in crime, it's often because people who are committing the crimes are no longer in those precarious situations. You point to the idea that there's a marginal benefit to spending more dollars on police, but studies have been very clear that there's a much greater benefit in investing in communities and making sure that people aren't poor to begin with. So what's the cost-benefit analysis? Do you think it's right for a city to be spending 50% of its funding on police officers?
Yeah, well, I think one thing to be clear about is, if I'm not mistaken, that figure of 53% doesn't account for the fact that LA gets a lot of its, LA City gets a lot of its funding for other social services from the county and the state. And so, you know, that may not exactly be representative of what other cities are doing. But I also want to push back on the idea that there's a correlation. But I want to push back on the idea that there's a correlation here between poverty and the sort of violence that we've seen actually go up. That's just not true. I mean, take New York City, for example, 1989, which is the year before New York City peaked with 2,262 homicides. Our citywide poverty rate was actually slightly lower than it was in 2016, which is the year before we hit our valley of 292 homicides. So we decreased homicides by about 90%, where poverty didn't move almost at all. In fact, it moved slightly in the wrong direction. We didn't see crime go up during the Great Recession, where you had the unemployment rate across the nation nearly doubled. During that time, the homicide rate declined by 15%. We didn't see a homicide spike during the Great Depression in the United States. We did see one during the 1920s, which is one of the periods of economic boom in this country. So the idea that there's a clear correlation between poverty and violence, I think, is just
isn't it clear? That's
wrong.
a straw man, Raphael. And your argument basically is while people were quarantined, crime was down, so poverty didn't have an effect.
On this.
Go ahead, Riley.
I honestly, I really don't. I really just wanted to clarify that we're really making the argument that, like, we came up with it, essentially, that the correlation between poverty and crime is hilarious. We have a criminal system that the vast majority of everybody in the system is broke, destitute. Over 60% of the people that are in our criminal system, over 2 million people are incarcerated in this country, 400,000 of which are held pre-trial, and over 60% of them made less than $12,000 annually prior to arrest. Poverty is what's in our system. I'm not asking you, unfortunately, I'm telling you. The majority of the people that are being represented in our system are represented by public defenders, which means they are underneath the poverty line. What you're saying is just not the case. If you look at it,
he's saying that the crime rate doesn't track the poverty rate, not that criminals are not poor.
Right. This doesn't tell you anything about. This doesn't tell you anything about which direction the causation.
Well, your feels and vibes and advice doesn't matter if that's not what the data shows.
The data shows it very clearly, though, Robbie. That's what's so concerning.
But it does.
But it clearly
really
doesn't.
because
It
it
clearly
doesn't tell
does.
you. It doesn't tell you what direction the causation runs. Right. The fact that the vast majority of people who come into contact with the criminal justice system are poor does not tell you that poverty causes violence, because most poor people are not criminals and they're not violent criminals. Right. The reality is that the sorts of dispositions that are likely to result in poor performance in our economic system are also likely to be correlated with criminal activity. That's the reality. The fact of the matter is that more common in the prison population in the United States is antisocial personality disorder, which has a prevalence rate among men in the general population of between 2 and 4%, but a prevalence rate in prison settings of between 40 and 70%.
Raphael, I
Way
really
more
want to
prevalent
let
than
Olay
poverty.
get a chance to get it worded
Go
there.
ahead, LA.
you're right that we do have a criminal system that's filled with mentally ill people and people that are not getting mental health services, right? People with mental health issues are 3 to 4 times more likely to end up incarcerated in America. That is an aggravating factor, to your point, not a mitigating factor. Additionally, as much as you want to focus on violent crime, and say all these different things and suggest that poverty has nothing to do with violence, which is absurd. But like I said at the beginning of this conversation, over 80% of the things in our criminal system have nothing to do with violent crime. They're misdemeanors, traffic offenses, or non-violent crime. So you can't just want to take out poverty and analysis to focus on sensationalizing violent crime when the majority of the people sitting in our criminal system are there for non-violent crime. So anyway, but I respectfully, I respect your disagreement on the topic.
Well, thank you both so much. Unfortunately, we got to leave it there. Really appreciate you both a lot.
And healthcare companies that abandon you when you're sick, the defense contractors that fund endless wars, and the big tech companies that censure you all give to Republicans and Democrats alike to ensure that whatever party wins an election, they are guaranteed to come out on top. Well, a new story about AIPAC, the group founded to lobby American politicians for favorable policies toward the Israeli government, exposes just how thoroughly elites have rigged our political system to undermine your voting power and, in effect, choose American Congress members. You might recall me mentioning in an old radar that Summer Lee, a Pennsylvania progressive, won a tough primary race back in May, despite AIPAC's PAC spending over $2 million against Lee and $660,000 in favor of her centrist establishment opponent in the Democratic Party. AIPAC ads targeted her as not a real Democrat. Let's take a look.
She calls herself a Democrat, but Summer Lee said she wanted to dismantle the Democratic Party. Dismantle it. And she's done everything in her power to do just that. When Joe Biden was running against Trump, Summer Lee attacked Biden's character, said he'd take us backwards. And Lee refused to support Biden's infrastructure plan that's now rebuilding bridges and roads in western Pennsylvania. Summer Lee, more interested in fighting Democrats than getting results. UDP is responsible for the content of this ad.
Critical of Biden, wants to dismantle the warmongering Democratic Party. Honestly, I know that's supposed to be an attack ad, but she'd have my vote. All kidding aside, the valence of AIPAC's ad is clear. The Democratic Party is good and should be protected, and voters who share that ideology should vote for Lee's opponent. That being the case, how wild is it that AIPAC is now supporting Lee's Republican opponent in the general election? This story broke over the weekend. AIPAC, which, as I explained in a recent radar, has tried to put its thumb on the scale against anti-establishment left candidates who are critical of Israel's treatment of Palestinians, is spending nearly $80,000 on Lee's opponent, who just happens to have the same name as the outgoing Democratic Representative Mike Doyle. They're literally trying to trick Democratic voters into voting for a familiar name. But of course, this Mike Doyle is a Republican. See, it seems AIPAC doesn't care who wins, D or R, as long as the candidate is the same type of milquetoast, pro-blob establishment figure that will routinely sign off on unbounded aid packages for Israel, ignoring the apartheid conditions of the Palestinian people. As a reminder, in Gaza, over 1.8 million Palestinians live in just 140 square miles of land in conditions described by former Prime Minister David Cameron as an open-air prison. To maintain or improve the geopolitical status quo, which includes a $38 billion overall military aid package signed by Obama, AIPAC has demonstrated that it is willing to smear anti-establishment candidates. Lee was accused of anti-Semitism, for example, for explaining how the phrase "Israel has a right to defend itself" had been used to justify atrocities against Palestinians. Of course, every country has a right to defend itself. But defending yourself isn't the issue when you're attacking worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is what Lee was responding to at the time of her tweets. Even Jewish politicians aren't safe. AIPAC spent millions to successfully defeat Andrew Lavin in the spring. It even went to war against America's most popular Jewish politician, Bernard Sanders. Now, of course, anti-Semitism is real. But AIPAC's involvement in these races isn't actually about anti-Semitism or protecting the interests of Jewish Americans. It's an explicitly pro-Israel lobbying group, not a pro-Jewish lobbying group, and it expressly aims to promote the security interests of Israel. This should not be controversial. It's what their website advertises. But I suspect my saying this will bring some charges of anti-Semitism. Why? Because it is, in fact, an anti-Semitic trope to imply that Jewish
Nope.
people have
Can't
dual
I?
loyalty. According to the World Jewish Congress, anti-Semites allege that the true allegiance of Jewish people is to their fellow Jews, and that therefore they are inherently disloyal citizens and cannot be trusted. In casting the Jew as the other, this anti-Semitic trope, which has existed for thousands of years, has been used to scapegoat, harass, and vilify Jews, and at times has even led to murder. So because of that trope, I want to be really, really clear. AIPAC is a lobbying group that advocates pro-Israel policies to the legislative and executive branches of the United States. It is not, its mission statement is not about protecting the Jewish people at large. Its stated mission is to promote pro-Israeli policies. I'm pointing out that what is good for Israel as a country might not be in the best interest of some American Jews, or American goys is not anti-Semitic in and of itself. And yet, when AOC called AIPAC out for funding both sides of this Pennsylvania race, AIPAC slammed her as anti-Semitic. Her crime? Saying, quote, shamefully, AIPAC is working for Republican control of Congress and further destabilization of U.S. democracy. In response, Executive Director at StopAntisemitism.org said, quote, the thinly veiled intent behind AOC's tweet to vilify a Jewish organization is crystal clear and further contributes to the vilification of American Jews. AOC's intentional isolation of AIPAC and her failure to call out the numerous bipartisan and left-leaning groups working to keep Justice Democrat candidate Summer Lee out of office shows her true colors, the rep continued. Now, in my humble Gentile opinion, slotting in American Jews as the party being vilified here, when the criticism is of a literal lobbying firm, is a pretty slick move that doesn't show a lot of respect for the diversity of thought among Jewish Americans, including many younger Jewish folks who tend to be more critical of Israeli foreign policy. But putting that aside, if you follow AIPAC's logic to its logical conclusion, AOC is forbidden from talking about how a super PAC is giving on both sides of an election, a super PAC that has donated more than almost every other group, because the country it represents was established as a Jewish state. All these super PACs, with their unlimited independent expenditures allowed by Citizens United, are anti-democratic. They allow rich elites to buy and sell candidates, kill popular policies, and have more power than your measly one vote. And for all the crowing about saving democracy Democrats have been doing lately, this is an issue they should linger on a little longer. Campaign finance reform, after all, has bipartisan support. Elite lobbying groups like those that represent banks and pharmaceutical companies are putting the thumb on the scale of our elections, killing populist candidates who might vote for, say, a wealth tax, lowering prescription drug prices, or legalizing marijuana. It's a big club, and you're not in it. And until the bottom starts to band together against the top, regardless of religion, race, age, or sex, nothing is going to change. So
Response to a tweet by Ilhan Omar, we proudly stand with the overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party that backs a strong U.S. alliance. AIPAC works to elect pro-Israel candidates, including Democratic leadership and half the Progressive Caucus. We oppose Summer Lee because of her dangerous views on the U.S.-Israel alliance. AIPAC and our 2 million grassroots members proudly support progressive candidates, including 148 Democrats this cycle, who don't check their values at the door when it comes to standing with Israel.
yeah, I think that statement kind of says it all. It is an expressly pro-Israel group that is in fact working to defeat a lot of progressive candidates who see progressivism as linked to also being progressive for the interests of Palestinians. And there's no reason that those interests have to be against each other. A lot of people are obviously very strongly hoping for a resolution to the conflict in the region that benefits all parties involved. But the idea of criticizing AIPAC's involvement when they're clearly trying to go after
he does
progressive
it. He
candidates
goes
who
bird
articulate
beak.
that there's a balance that needs to be struck here, and you need to be able to support Palestinian interests as well. And disguising that behind this kind of these claims of anti-Semitism, where there isn't any, is a real problem.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I mean, is this deception, though? I mean, it's the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, right? That's what it stands for. It doesn't represent itself as a group as like a Jewish advocacy group. It's a group that explicitly wants stronger ties between the U.S. and Israel, that supports the funding we give to Israel. I do not support that. You know, that's what they're doing. they give money to candidates who support that aim. I
Yeah,
don't
of
like.
course. But when they attack a candidate on the basis of them being anti-Semitic, when the real issue is that they don't like the candidate's policies toward Israel, that's where the slippage occurs, because nobody wants to vote for an anti-Semitic candidate. And so they get a lot more traction out of saying, don't vote for Summer Lee, she's an anti-Semite. Don't vote for Nina Turner, she's an anti-Semite. Than if they say, don't vote for Nina Turner, she advocates for Palestinian rights.
Do they call Nina Turner an
Oh,
anti-Semite?
there were scads of advertisements calling Nina Turner an anti-Semite. Just like there's these attacks that have gone after AOC simply for calling out AIPAC's involvement in this race. And the argument is, well, why isn't AOC calling out all these other groups? AIPAC's one of the biggest spinners in this race. And also, this is the first time AIPAC has gotten involved in a general election between a Republican and a Democrat, after also having weighed in the Democratic primary.
Look,
So what are the political incentives here, and how should voters respond? This is the real issue, the broader lobbying question. How should voters respond to the fact that in our democracy, big moneyed groups are weighing in to both pick the primary candidate, and when they didn't like the primary candidate selection, switch to the other side of the aisle and try to make sure that the candidate doesn't win by supporting the person on the other side? That seems like, to me, fundamentally anti-democratic, and it's an exaggeration.
Democrats have done to help pick
100%.
the more MAGA candidate in the
100%,
race.
100%. And look, back in the day, it was people like John McCain who were advocating for campaign finance reform. This used to be something at the front of mind for a lot of Americans, and just completely went out of the window
Yeah,
post Obama era.
I'm not a major fan of. I feel like the campaign finance reform. It feels like a magic solution, but the most entrenched and powerful lobbying efforts find ways. The smart, then the very insidery people find some way to get around the structure you erect. Like the super PACs. That whole thing is a creation of the McCain-Feingold era campaign finance stuff, which then most of that got stricken down by the Supreme Court anyway. But we just created an entirely new alternative. You categorize your money and your advocacy as everything. You're 501c3 instead of 501c4, et cetera, so on and so forth. It seems like, especially given the wide latitude our Supreme Court believes that money counts as speech, it does not seem possible to me to separate money from politics. You can make politics less appealing for moneyed interests to participate in by having the government, by having there be less at stake. That would be my solution.
Well, I mean, I do think
by limiting the government's power.
I would disagree that
if our government wasn't gonna give tons of money for Israel's defense, then there'd be less reason for AIPAC to get involved in these races.
Well, no, I think that the part of
We
the
can
reason.
cut off our foreign donations.
Well, I mean, part of the reason that we do give so much money to Israeli defense is because of AIPAC. They're effective. They're doing their job. But I do think that the bigger issue here is that there are campaign finance reforms that we can get into. We don't have time to get into them today. But people shouldn't treat this as a fait accompli. They should be pushing back against these corporations, lobbying groups, etc., who are, frankly, undermining democracy at least as much as anything that Donald Trump is being accused of at the moment.
We'll have more Rising right after this. Stay tuned.
Oops.
Brianna, what's on your radar?
Yeah, I don't know if it'll...
Well, the question is, why is Stacey Abrams struggling with black men? At least that's a question asked by a recent New York Times article, which laments that Abrams, who has long been championed as a strategic genius who architected the 2020 Georgia congressional wins that got Democrats the Senate, is falling behind in her own bid for governor. While Raphael Warnock is pulling ahead of opponent Brian Kemp by about 5 points, the New York Times notes that Abrams is trailing and that her campaign lacks the, quote, energy of her congressional counterpart. Specifically, the Times points to poll results that show that black men, who are a key part of the constituency that brought Abrams so close to defeating Kemp in 2018, don't seem as motivated to vote for her this time around. And given how much the Democratic Party has praised Abrams for her ability to turn out voters in other people's elections, some are asking why she doesn't seem to be able to deliver for herself. Did she receive unwarranted or unearned praise for her role in the 2020 Georgia Senate races? Praise that would be more accurately attached to less visible activists in the state? Or alternatively, is her own flailing electoral career evidence that the Democratic Party's choice to focus on expanding the black voter base rather than courting and persuading existing voters of all races is a bad one. Abrams' defenders are right to note that the comparison to Raphael Warnock's race is a little bit apples to oranges. Abrams faces an incumbent. Warnock has the incumbency. Warnock also has the advantage of teeing off against one of the weakest Republican candidates in the field. Herschel Walker, a former football player, politician, has been dogged by controversy. For example, he offered one of the more unique critiques of the Inflation Reduction Act, saying that, quote, a lot of money, it's going to trees, and we have enough trees. At one point, he used a laminated special deputy sheriff badge to burnish his fake law enforcement bona fides, and he's currently facing new television ads run by Democrats emphasizing violent threats he allegedly made against his ex-wife. There was even a sort of zany controversy about how many children the man actually has. Brian Kemp, by contrast, is a much less controversial figure to run against. Not only does he have the benefit of incumbency, he's been pushing back against...
That's old.
Brianna, what's on your radar?
I don't know how to sugarcoat this, Robbie, so I'll just say it. It seems clear that the Democratic Party is over. I saw the writing on the wall and left after the Obama years. He was probably the best the party had to offer, and he revealed himself to be a truly disappointing character. You could drive a Bronco through the gap between his campaign promises and reality, and 14 years after he promised hope and change, we still have no campaign finance reform, Roe isn't codified, and instead of using his incredible political gifts to advance the interests of the communities he was supposed to represent, he's now angling to buy a basketball team. I guess it's easier to crush a future strike if you own a franchise. Now, that's not to say he did nothing. It's meaningful, truly, to not be denied health insurance because of a pre-existing condition. It matters that 35 million Americans got insurance in the first place through the ACA. But it wasn't enough. I was hopeful that an independent senator from Vermont might right the ship. Bernie stood up to Barack Obama when he...
One of the things I want to talk about while I'm doing this series is I was talking in an earlier video about where she stops. Watch, to be 46 minutes already on the video. Yeah, that was it.